When I first asked if Edgar Degas could be Jack the Ripper, a lot of you had very pertinent questions, insightful questions based on your own knowledge of the subject. But I had to stop myself from answering based on speculation alone because although I had theories, I wanted to back them up, and now I have the research. One of the most enduring mysteries of Jack the Ripper is why did he start and stop so suddenly? Any theory into his identity has to also address that. And so when investigating Edgar Degas, the French painter of ballerinas, as the suspect, you have to answer three main questions related to the timing of the murders. The first is, why would Edgar Degas start so late in life? After all, in 1888, he was 53 years old, which puts very close to the upper bounds of the average age of a serial killer. There just aren't many at all over 55. The second question is, why would a Parisian go to London to do these murders? The third question is nearly the same. If he did go to London for these murders, why did he stop in the end of 1888? All three of these questions were easily answered by what was my theory, which was that he did not start with the London murders. He started in Paris, which would be typical of serial killer behavior. Most start in their own backyard. However, I didn't want to introduce that theory until I had receipts. I wanted to find murders that matched the MO, and now I have. Which led me to reading scans of old French newspapers, which thankfully are easy to find online. And as I and other sources were speculating on the weirdly high number of unsolved sex worker murders in Paris, I came across a scholarly work mostly about the French press at the time, but examining it through the lens of one of the most high-profile sex worker murders of the time. After the Franco-Prussian War, France entered the Third Republic, and they were granted freedom of the press in 1881. Until that time, all press coverage of murders was covered by the state. After 1881, private presses flourished, but they had to compete with each other. They had to stand out, which led to the Fait, which was a new type of crime reporting that focused on the mystery of it. It was well suited to daily papers because it reported on a murder as new evidence emerged. And so if you were following the coverage of a murder, you would want to buy tomorrow's paper too to find out what had happened. This was probably the advent of the true crime girlie. Using this book and French newspapers, I was able to identify the murders of 8 different high-profile sex workers between 1879 and 1887. There were also another 3 unidentified female torsos that had been mutilated beyond recognition found within that period. Of these 11 murders, only 2 were ever attributed to anyone. Keep in mind that prior to 1881, any murders might have been hushed up, because when the press is state-run, unsolved crimes should be hushed up as they are destabilizing. But if you were to assume that 1879 was the date of the first sex worker murder, then that would place Degas being 45 years of age, which is closer to a reasonable time to start. However, you could also just assume that he started before then and there is no record. And if we're creating a timeline, we should also note that Degas became friends with XIXe in 1883. They immediately hit it off. XIXe was prone to sycophantism. We'd probably call him a groupie today. He wanted to be with the most famous people that he could, but he was a famous artist in his own right. He should also sound familiar to anyone who follows the Jack the Ripper murders because he has also been named as a suspect. Patricia Cornwell, in particular, wrote 2 full-length books about him perhaps being Jack the Ripper. She did a lot of thorough investigative work, and I do believe that she thoroughly proved that XIXe was the author of many of the letters sent to the press claiming to be Jack the Ripper. Throughout his entire lifetime, Walter also maintained that he knew who Jack the Ripper was, and that he had rented an apartment that Jack the Ripper had stayed at. And therefore, I do kind of believe that they worked together. You see, in 1887, Marie Renault was murdered. Marie Renault was a high-end courtesan. She was a member of what the French termed at that time the demi-monde, coined by Alexandre Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers. The phrase demi-monde means half-world. These women were discreet, well-educated. Although they were technically sex workers, they stayed true to one man who was their protector. He would provide them with a nice house, an apartment, gifts, sometimes even an income. And Marie Renault was one of the most sought after, the most discreet, and one might say the most conservative of the demi-monde. But that's not what garnered this murder so much press attention. The news that set Paris aflutter was not that she was murdered, but that her housekeeper and her housekeeper's 11-year-old daughter were also murdered. All 3 women's throats were slit. Crime journalists and police were in a race to see who could solve this murder first, and the man they eventually blamed was named Prezzini. And interestingly enough, he was an Egyptian gigolo. Hence the courtesan and the gigolo. But if you think the O.J. Simpson trial was big, if you think the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp trial was big, Try to imagine those cases happening in a world without television or the internet. The press simply could not provide enough coverage on the murders of sex workers. They were out on the streets trying to find out more interesting stories that related to the murders of Marie Renault. So, if your MO was to murder sex workers, Paris was not the place to be doing it. At least not in 1887 or 1888. And interestingly enough, the courtesan and the gigolo mentions the Jack the Ripper murders. As investigators knew only too well, the Rue Montagne tragedy was the latest in a series of unsolved murders targeting the women of the Parisian demi-monde. In the preceding 8 years, the police had struggled to make any headway in solving the crimes, and Parisians, goaded by newspaper reporters, were growing anxious. Why then has this string of prostitute murders faded into such obscurity that today's Parisians can recall nothing of it? Timing, in large part. The Rue Montagne investigation predates the first of the Jack the Ripper murders in East London by little more than a year. In fact, London's initial response to the Whitechapel slayings was to recall the Rue Montagne, and the Ripper investigation quickly took on a life of its own. Over time, Ripper lore eclipsed the Parisian cases in popular memory and in scholarly interest. A steady output of fictionalizations, films, comics, and academic studies now fall under the rubric Ripperology, which has no Parisian equivalent. The author goes on to discuss some other similarities of it, saying that they bear notable points of convergence. So if you thought that Edgar Degas could possibly be Jack the Ripper, but why did he go to London to start the murders, and then why did he stop going to London? Then in both cases, the answer is the press. At first the heat was on in Paris, and then the heat grew worse in London. And if you were wondering whether there were murders of sex workers in Paris after 1888, yes. Yes, there were. For more details on the specific murders, I will be posting about the most suspicious of those murders. Either follow this string of videos or me. The unsolved 1879 murder in particular is on point. Thanks for tuning in.